Warm greetings. We are gathered here to commemorate the bicentenary of the death of John Keats. His tombstone bears the words, "Here lies the one whose name was writ in water." However, 200 years later, Keats' legacy is still alive in the minds and hearts of all who have read his works and felt it upon their pulses. It would only be apt to say, "Thou was not born for death, immortal birth." I am Niha Headley, second year BA English Literature student of Alphonsa College, and I'll be the host of today's event. I'm profusely elated to call upon Reverend Dr. James Joseph, the head of the Department of English, Alphonsa College, to welcome the gathering.
Dear respected Dr. Scott Massen, respected Dr. Sister Gigi Molanji, Principal of Alphonsa College, respected Dr. Shaji John, Vice Principal of Alphonsa College, respected Dr. Regina Ma Joseph, Vice Principal of Alphonsa College, respected professors, teachers, scholars, students, and my friends. Postgraduate Department of English, Alphonsa College, Pala, with immense joy and happiness, presents before you an international web series on English literature with special focus on Romanticism. Our aim is to provide a comprehensive knowledge about English literature, focusing on artistic, literary, and intellectual movements. We have decided to start this program today because today is the bicentennial death anniversary of John Keats. We all know that John Keats will always be remembered for his contributions to the new levels of aestheticism. Today, the first lecture will be delivered by Dr. Scott Massen, Associate Professor of English Literature at Tyndale University, Toronto, Canada. Professor Rosemary Carter will introduce Dr. Scott Massen in detail. In the coming sessions, which will be announced in a few days, we will have lectures on literature from 1066 to the present day. Now, I wish you all a very fruitful academic program for our intellectual growth. Now, I wholeheartedly welcome all the participants for this session. Now, I also welcome Professor Rosemary to introduce and welcome Dr. Scott Massen to this session.
Thank you, Father. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Scott Massen. Dr. Massen is an Associate Professor of English Literature at Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada. He teaches on subjects ranging from the literature of the Greco-Roman period, the Bible as literature, Shakespeare, Milton, 17th century literature, romantic literature, the work of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, science fiction, practical criticism, and classical and contemporary literary theory. Some of his research interests lie in exploring the way that the humanities have been repealed and replaced by the human sciences and a new constructivist anthropology. Tradition was abandoned in favor of the goal of a wholly self-constructed humanity. The problems with this model has led him to seek to recover the integrity and scope of its educational forebear, classical education, and a richer humanities tradition, another primary interest. It led him to found the Westminster Classical Christian Academy in Toronto and to be central to revival of classical education in Canada. Dr. Massen is a familiar face for those who follow his online lectures in his YouTube channel covering a range of topics. It is indeed his generosity that he has accepted our invitation to deliver the Keats bicentennial lecture despite all the inconveniences. Dr. Massen will be speaking to us on Keats' Spring Odes. The participants who have questions may kindly type it out in the chat box. We'll be reading out a few selected questions at the end of the session. Thank you. Over to you, Niha.
You're muted. You're still muted, Nita.
Niha?
She's muted.
Niha, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. We are about to listen to the Keats Bicentennial Lecture by Dr. Scott Massen. Participants who want to raise their questions can type it in their chat box. A few selected questions will be read out after this session. And now it gives me immense pleasure to invite Dr. Scott Massen to deliver his lecture, Keats' Spring Odes, his season of mellow fruitfulness. So please.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to speak to you on such an important occasion. I think Keats is, without a doubt, one of the great poets of the English language, despite his young years and his untimely death. He died at the age of 25. I've entitled the lecture Seasons of Mellow Fruitfulness, which is taken not from the Spring Odes, but rather from his Ode to Autumn. And yet, the reason I chose it as a title is because I think by the time he was writing the Spring Odes, he most certainly knew that he was entering the autumn of his life, because by that point he had contracted tuberculosis and knew that he was dying. So that adds a particular poignancy, I think, to the poems and their subject matter. I want to say something about Keats's biography as a prelude to looking at the poetry, because I think the man himself is interesting, and his background to some degree shapes his interests as a poet and the things that he tries to do with his poetry. So just a very brief little sketch of that. He was born on October 31st, 1795. That's Halloween, celebrated here. I don't know about in India, but he was born the first child of Thomas and Frances Keats. He had four, there were four of them in total. His father, however, and this is part of the tragedy of Keats's entire life, his father died shortly after he moved at the age of around 8. And his mother died of tuberculosis when he was only 14. And so left him with an elderly grandmother to look after them, his mother's mother. And so he was orphaned and knew grief from early years, and that shaped him. And his grandmother was not very good with money, and she didn't have much use furthermore for education. And he only stayed in school to the age of 15, which is, I think, rather extraordinary, but not unprecedented in terms of literary precedent, or even in terms of great people in history who've had to overcome adversity. In fact, in some ways have been so deeply formed by the adversity that they shine brighter for the difficulties of their life. But at the age of 15, he had to leave school, and he went into an apprenticeship, and the apprenticeship was in a hospital as a surgeon's apprentice. Now, in our day and age, to go into the hospital, into the medical profession, tends to be something that is highly esteemed. It's something that is very competitive, difficult to get into. In Keats's day, it's a pretty awful profession. Remember, at that age, they have no means of anesthetics or anything like that. So he is seeing all around him. They have no understanding of microbiology, anything like that. So the hygiene issues that we expect in hospitals now were not there. So he saw death, not only in his own parents at a young age, but also in the hospital. And yet, in spite of that, or in with that as the backdrop, he took interest in poetry. So he was a medical student at Guy's Hospital. He attended lectures. He helped in the hospital wards. But he started to write poetry. He started to write poetry at the age of 20. And when he did so at a prodigious rate, not just the amount of work. It's more the rate at which he matured as a writer, which is most extraordinary. And he read the great poets, and he particularly gravitated to poets like Spenser and Milton and Shakespeare. And Milton and Shakespeare in particular, I think, are the main dominant influences in terms of historical figures. In terms of contemporaries, I think we would probably say it would be Wordsworth. And I'll say more about that in a minute when we come to the spring odes, because of the focus of the odes and the particular ways in which I think we can see some inheritances from Wordsworth, but at the same time, a very different approach to poetry and to the use of literary language. Very different. Two poets that are focused on the life of the mind, and yet at the same time use language in very, very different ways. But in the fall of 1818, I mentioned that his mother died of tuberculosis. His brother Tom also contracted tuberculosis. It's a pulmonary disease. It affects the lungs. You end up spitting blood and so forth. You die. It's not a pleasant death. And he nursed his brother Tom and probably contracted tuberculosis while doing so. So this would be late 1818. At that point, he's now 23 years of age. And at the same time, he met a young woman. Her name was Fanny Braun, and got engaged to her. So in the midst of the pain and the suffering, there was also the joy and the hope and the love which was entering in his life at this time. And this is these two things, the suffering, which is the crucible of, I think, Keats's poetry, but also the joy and the delight and the hope for the future are there in his odes. So when he, as I say, looks after Tom, he probably contracts tuberculosis at that time, 1818. And he writes the spring odes in the spring of 1819. And by that point, I mean, it's not something that one can mistake about. And he had seen it firsthand. He started spitting blood. But he wrote these extraordinary odes. Now, let me say a little bit about the ode. The form of the ode is something that he just took to around this time. He had experimented with forms like the sonnet. He had tried his hand at various other forms. He read a great deal of Milton, as I said, and Shakespeare, and I think you can see the dramatic qualities of Shakespeare and his influence in Keats's poetry, this dialectical sort of a dramatic dialogue that takes place within the poems. It's not, he doesn't write drama, but there's nonetheless a sense of voices speaking within the context of his poetry that shows his inheritance, the Shakespearean inheritance. He also tried his hand at the Miltonic epic, the grand approach to it. And all of these were his ways of exploring for himself what sort of poet he was going to be. He didn't want to follow the neoclassical mode of the 18th century, Pope and his inheritance. He was more interested in progressive forms of poetry along the lines that Wordsworth espoused. And so he gravitated towards that. But there was a time when he was uncertain about that, and he explored questions. Should I, and we'll see these questions arising in the odes themselves. We'll look at a few in a minute. But should poetry be an escape from life? A sort of dreamlike, if you know Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, a place where one goes and the world seems to disappear, and to some sense, a better world, but also to some extent, an impossible world is imagined and also is experienced. Should it do that in a life of sensations, or should it perhaps dwell on that other thing I mentioned, which is so characteristic of Keats, the suffering of humanity. And for Keats, the meaning of that suffering, Keats is not what we experience in the 20th century, at least in European culture, this nihilism, this sense, the existentialism, the sense of a loss, the vanity or the total hopelessness of life. There's no meaning to life at all. We don't get that with Keats. He reflects on suffering, he reflects on death, but he doesn't see death as a meaningless thing, or life for that matter. So he's not an existentialist, nor for that matter a nihilist. But when he does that, should he take the Shakespearean approach and do it in a way that portrays the complexity of humanity, the diversity of humanity, and the clashing purposes that come from the different the political spheres and the familial spheres and the international spheres and the religious spheres, all of these things, or should he focus more on the grand themes, the epic sweep and Milton's artistry? Well, he tries his hands at the epics, as I say. The two Hyperion poems for sure are epics, or at least attempts at epics. But I think he's finding his stride when he comes to the Spring Odes. And in general, I think the critical tradition would share the sentiments that I'm expressing here on that front, that the Odes are Keats's best poetry. If you're going to read anything by Keats, you will go to these poems. That's not to say that they're easy poems to access. I think there needs to be something that is said to students to come in to approach and understand that. But I mentioned that Keats was dramatic in his presentation, and we can see that in the way that the voices will speak in his poems. And what I want to say in that is what we don't get, and some people find this frustrating, and I myself find it frustrating at points, is there's no resolution to the questioning. There'll be a voice speaking, an antithetical voice, an antiphonal voice to some degree, speaking back, and then he will move on a little bit, and there'll be another way of looking at it. And he does so in a way that there is a sense of progress in the poems, but nonetheless, there's no resolution. There's no answer. He doesn't provide an answer. Very different than, I would say, Milton and Shakespeare. Very, very different there. They have a structured worldview, a Christian worldview in both cases, in Milton's case, particularly emphasized in the poetry. The theological premises of Christian theology are at the forefront of his poetry, but in Shakespeare, it's part of the structure of even a tragedy. There's a sense of closure at the end of it. The bad guys are dead on the stage, and the villains are punished for transgressions. In the comedies, there's a marriage scene at the end. So there's always a sense of providence and ordering and purpose and meaning in Shakespeare. In Keats, we have questions being asked and answers being given, and then other questions being asked, but there isn't a sense of resolution. And I find that to some degree dissatisfactory on the whole in a comparative way. Nonetheless, this should not negate the excellences of his poetry. Two things I want to say from his letters before I get to the poems themselves. One thing that he mentions in one of his letters is the ideal of negative capability. And this he connected with the figure of Shakespeare, as opposed to Wordsworth. And what he said about Shakespeare was he had the capacity to negate his own personality, such that we, the audience, had no idea what William Shakespeare thought about anything, because every one of his characters was so plausible, in fact, so vibrant, that one would have thought that Shakespeare was that character, that he knew what it was like to be a young woman in this situation, or an old man in this situation, or that. So the characters, much like Dickens, had this vibrancy about them, and so because of this, he thought this was a great feature of a poetic imagination, was this negative capability. That's the one dynamic. The other, though, is that he talks about the way that poetry can form an individual identity, and he uses the language very strongly. He talks about it even in terms of soul making, of forming a personal identity in a world of pains and troubles. And he says that, in fact, he finds this so appealing that he sees it as a grander system of salvation than the Christian religion. Now, he and I would agree to disagree on this. But he died a young man, and who knows what would have happened had he lived longer and explored these questions further. But those two things, this capacity to negate one's personal views, to be realistic in one's portraiture, and at the same time to take into account the reality and importance of suffering in forming individual identities. And that the latter seems a very Christian thing, actually, the importance of suffering. And when I say Christian, it's also a religious thing. There's a place for suffering in many religions and the importance thereof. But his greatest poems, as I say, are the Spring Odes. And why don't we turn to that, and then I'll make some commentaries about his style and the particular features of the style. I don't want to have you hear me drone on the whole time, although you did invite me to lecture, but it would be terrible for me to go through a lecture on Keats and not read copious passages from Keats's own work. That seems to me a fitting tribute rather than hearing me speak. Let's hear the man that we're honoring speak here. I want to say, with respect to the Spring Odes, there are 5 of them. I mentioned that the Ode to Autumn is not one of them, although it is a great ode. But the 5 odes are the Ode to Psyche, and these are in the order, we believe at any rate. Ode to Psyche, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode on Melancholy, and finally the Ode on Indolence. Now, the latter 4 have similar literary features in terms of the delineation and the stylistic features. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I don't want to neglect the Ode to Psyche, because the Ode to Psyche gives it the thematic focus for the other 4 odes, I think, fall into line once we look at the focus of the Ode to Psyche, which I'm only going to mention but not actually look at, because it will take away from the brief time that I have to speak on the other odes, and I don't want to neglect what I think the greater odes are. So the premise of the poem, Ode to Psyche, is that the poetry of the future being the sort of progressive poetry that he thought Wordsworth was writing, would be a look at the mind and the inner life, and that would be the landscape, as it were, for the poets of the future. The poets of the 18th century typically used landscape. There's landscape painting, there's landscape poetry in many ways. It's very much descriptive, and in even the romantic poetry, you can see in the introductions, like William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, there's a lengthy title that goes on about a paragraph. That's not atypical of the period. So the actual physical location is an important aspect of the reflection. But Keats is more interested in Wordsworth's what we would call a psychological turn. So the turn within and looking at the life of the mind. And so he writes an Ode to Psyche, Psyche being in this case taken from the Roman author Apuleius's story about how Psyche has aroused the jealousy of Venus. Venus is the goddess of love, of course, in Roman literature. And she sends Cupid to deal with her and to drive her away from her home, and to fall in love with a deformed individual. But unfortunately, Cupid falls in love with Psyche. And so it becomes a reflection on the relationship of love to the mind. That's how Keats takes it. And interestingly, you mentioned when I was introduced, I have an interest in C.S. Lewis. Lewis uses that for his greatest literary work as well, the very same tale in his magnificent novel, Till We Have Faces. You might want to have a look at that. I really think it's his greatest literary work, and not much read compared to some of his others. But at any rate, that psychological turn, the focus on the mind, and the importance of love in that become the backdrop for the following odes. And those are the ones I want to focus on. So first of all, Ode to a Nightingale. Ode to a Nightingale. I'm gonna focus on Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on the Grecian Urn. And I'm gonna neglect some of the others, and again, just for the sake of space and time. The Ode to a Nightingale and the Ode on a Grecian Urn are arguably the two most written on of sorry, it's not a very elegant way of putting it, but the two poems upon which scholars have devoted the most ink. More ink has been spilled over these two poems than any other poems. They become the test cases for literary theories, particularly the Ode on a Grecian Urn. I myself spent a whole year for my doctoral thesis looking at the Ode on a Grecian Urn. I thought it would never end, and I started to hate the Ode on a Grecian Urn. And it's not because it's hateful. It's just this. It was the scholarship. There I go. I said it. Having to read the scholars on the Ode on a Grecian Urn was awful. But at any rate, enough of my pain and suffering. It was soul making, right? But the Ode to a Nightingale is presented in the dramatic terms in which I said Keats's poetry tends to present itself. And it's a process of a changing response to a symbol. And in this case, it's the symbol of a nightingale. Now, a nightingale is a symbol of the imagination. You can see it back in Milton, in I believe it's L'Allegro. You can also see it in Shakespeare's work. It has a beautiful song. It's a songbird. You can hear it sing in England in the spring. It's absolutely gorgeous. We don't have them here in Canada. But there's it represents the greeting of the spirit, the way in which the loving nature of the poet responds to the mind, or vice versa. Is the nightingale the figure of love greeting the mind, or is it the other way around? It's hard to say. And he will do the exact same thing when he comes to the Ode on a Grecian Urn. He will engage with an object, in the latter case, an object that is static, and an object which is the repository of ashes. So it's a symbol of death. The one's a symbol of joy and the imagination. The other is a symbol of death. In the latter case, the Ode on a Grecian Urn, it also is a symbol. It's a Grecian urn, and as such, it has certain resonances in the culture of the day. Greek art was seen as sublime art, and his friend Benjamin Robert Hayden was particularly intrigued by the Greek, and there was this radical move to try and embrace Greek art as the quintessence, the quintessence of sublimity. Keats was engaging with both of these forms of ideal artistry in the poems. So without saying anything more there, why don't I read the poem, Ode to a Nightingale, and I will then comment on some of the stylistic features. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and lithe words had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret here, where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save from what from heaven is, with breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. But in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild. White hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn, the same that oft-times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So that's the Ode to a Nightingale. What we can note about this poem, let me just say a few things that are become characteristic of all of the odes that follow here. In the ode to Psyche, the form is not that which is in the following four poems. The following four poems, the four odes, have a common literary feature, namely they're of stanzas of 10 lines. And within the 10 lines, there is a quatrain at the outset, a Shakespearean quatrain, as it were, and a sestet from Petrarch. Now, as I said, he had earlier on written sonnets. Here he has taken features from those things, and this is what good poets do. They read other poets' work, and they take the features that they like, and they mold and shape them to their own ends, for their own purposes and functions. And this is what Keats has done here. So he's taken a quatrain at the outset, probably taken from Shakespeare's sonnets, which tend to have 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet at the end. And he's taken the sestet from Petrarch and combined them here. So 10-line stanzas. And we will note about them also that they have a very distinct shape. They are very regular. They end at the line's end. They tend not to enjam over into the next line. That gives them a certain sense of as I say, regularity and a pattern to it, and it's a strong patterning. Within that regularity, within that sense of stasis, of fixity, there is a great deal of movement. And one of the ways that Keats does that is by using participles instead of adjectives to describe. So participles being forms of verbs. So a example here. But in general, he uses participles and adjectives, but they have the verbal features of the original verbs, and so there's a sense of activity and movement even within the context of the line. Now, those features are what he also does, and this is what makes Keats so important to the literary tradition that follows him. And on that front, I probably should say a great deal myself. And that's because he combined in very, very concrete images certain aesthetic experiences to combine them in ways that are rich, memorable. And they have another feature to draw to your attention, and that is something that in the 1890s is particularly delightful to the critics of the day. It's his use of synesthesia, this term, S-Y-N, aesthesia, A-E-S-T-H-E-S-I-A. What is meant by that is the way in which he uses and combines various senses in ways which we don't normally associate them with. In Keats's case, he often appeals to senses of touch and taste when he's describing what he sees and hears. And those are not ordinary associations, and they give them a sense of it's palpable, it's sensible, it's in front of you, it's very much of a bodily thing, and it's very much reflecting on his sense of pain. At the same time, remember what he is talking when he's speaking here. He almost is speaking as the disembodied spirit. He's listening. He says, "Darkling, I listen." He's listening in the dark. He can't see what he's describing. And when he comes to describing things, there's a richness of imagery that is, someone once said that reading Keats is like opening a box of chocolates of various types, and it's just every sentence has a morsel there of delight, and I think it's true. And the poem does that. Now, what the other thing about that in general we'll say about the Ode to a Nightingale here is that the stanzas themselves have this sense of fixity and closure, and there isn't a sense of continuity between the stanzas. It ends, and then it moves on to something at times altogether different. There is sometimes a continuity, but at other times a very distinct shift away from that. So a sense of the movement of the author, at least in his mind, if not in his body, but a sense of movement going on because of the way in which one stanza doesn't follow the other stanza. So there isn't a sense of a narrative there. It's more of a dramatic encounter, which I spoke of at the outset, and less of a narrative. And if you're looking for the poem to narrate something, you're going to find yourself very frustrated because it doesn't do that. It, as I say, it's an encounter. Which I said was characteristic of Keats in his poetry, and also the symbolic poetry, which becomes the legacy of Keats and the era. But as I say, this ode is marked by death, most certainly. For all of the delight of the Nightingale's song and the beauty of the Nightingale song, what it makes him reflect upon is how the beauty of the Nightingale is nonetheless immortal, and yet he is immortal. So there's something unfitting about it. He says later on that what he hears, the beauty that he hears, was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. So he's speaking of the nightingale as a timeless thing, as having been there throughout the ages and being spoken of in poetry and in song as a thing of beauty. And yet those people who heard that song are no more. And he, as a man, cannot but reflect on his own mortality. And he does so, as we said in my brief introduction of his biography, he does so with a painful awareness of the suffering of those in around him. So when he mentions the youth who grow pale and spectre thin and dies, he's doubtless thinking of his brother Tom. And where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs. So there's an example of the participle used as an adjective there, leaden-eyed. Or is it? No, it's not actually. It's a lead. It's not. Is not a verb. But where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or love pine at them beyond tomorrow. So there's a sense of sheer delight, transport, transcendence to some degree, evoked by the nightingale, which is a figure of the imagination to some degree, and nonetheless a sense of that it is not satisfactory. There's something that evokes that is greater than he, and yet there's something inappropriate about it, something that is lacking in this delightful thing. We'll find the same thing characterize his Ode on a Grecian Urn, which I'll get to in a minute. You may want to follow up with questions on this afterwards. I think that's the format, so we'll leave it at that. But note that at various points, so he moves for, I mentioned his sense of taste and touch. He regularly speaks of the draught of vintage, and he has the sense of hemlock that he had drunk. Again, these are appeals to taste, and the touch of and the imagination here evokes Shakespearean things. He talks about Bacchus and his parts, the queen moon, and the starry phase, and so forth, probably from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream references there. From darkling, I listened probably from Milton's work, I think, this word darkling. But he thinks that it is rich to die. Now, remember what I said, Keats at this point, aware of his own death, preoccupied with the thought of death, and yet not thinking that death is a meaningless thing. It's not moving towards to nullify the meaning of life. He thinks that it will be rich to die. Now, there's something also slightly perverse about this, but it's almost a consummation that will come in his death, which one would have thought, as someone who is not a Christian, would not immediately appeal to him. And yet he speaks of pain and suffering as the veil of soul making. And so it's in keeping with that same sense that he has there. And really what he is reflecting on is something very profound, I think, and very moving to many. But note that at the conclusion of this, and I want to move to the Ode on a Grecian Urn, at the conclusion of this, he then says that he is told, he hears like a bell tolling him back from thee. Now note the word he uses, thee, here. This is an intimate term. The English language these days has lost the sense of thou and thee and uses the polite form, the you. The polite form is a form of distance, of respect, but also of a lack of intimacy. Here he speaks of the nightingale as if it were a beloved. And again, it might have the Psyche, Cupid resonances in the backdrop here. But he says, the very sound is like a bell that told me back from thee to my soul self. So it was a love song which Keats was pouring forth to the nightingale with its own song. And yet he has found that the encounter has been fruitless, and now he's back on himself and his own devices. And now he only has the question, was it a vision or a waking dream? Note the contrast here. Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So the synesthesia is also contrasted by the idea of, is it a vision? Is it a total fanciful thing? Is it music, or is it, am I awake or am I sleeping? All of these things. Now, I don't think he is under I don't think he's actually drunk the opiate that he mentions at the outset, but this would be characteristic of the period as well, of Coleridge. Let me move on to Ode on a Grecian Urn. It does very much the same sort of thing, but to a very different object. The one's a natural object. It is a I would say conventional figure of inspiration, the songbird. Here we have a totally unlikely object of poetic inspiration. It is a funeral vase. It contains the ashes of a dead person. And yet, because of the association of the Greeks, now there's a sort of a classicism which is reviving now through Germany and making its way to England. And Keats probably saw the Elgin marbles, which had been taken from Greece. They were on the ground and they were brought to the British Museum. Keats had seen these and they were being raved about by his friend Benjamin Robert Haydon. And Haydon was raving about how these were the quintessence of sublime artistry and so forth, basing his thinking on from the German author Winckelmann, the silent grandeur of Greek art. So Keats says, okay, let's try this same thing with a different object. And here's the object. It is a Grecian urn. It's probably just written a week or two after the Ode to a Nightingale. Once more, comparison, contrast. The nightingale song is by definition fleeting. It sings it, it's gone. And yet there's an immortality about it because nightingales come and go and they don't have individual personalities per se. But it's spontaneous and it's natural. Whereas the urn is static, it is silent, and it is the object or the product of human artistry. One's a natural form of artistry, the other is an artificial one. Which one is greater? This is a debate in the 18th century. Is the greatest art the most natural, which Shakespeare was said to be, or is it more like conventional, following poetic conventions? I think I'm running short of time here, so I'm going to watch myself here. Let me just say, I'm not going to read the poem, then I'll make just a few comments. Just the opening line. Thou, once again the intimate form of address, still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. All of these things are appeals to the sound of silence. Silence has no sound. It's the absence of sound. And yet, and likewise, he speaks of it as a still unravished bride. Now, there's a sense of connecting love with silence again, she's the bride of quietness, but they're also with there's a sexual connotation there. It's a bride, but it's an unravished bride. And yet we know he's speaking of a Grecian urn, which is again an object that contains the remains of ashes of dead people. So it's totally inappropriate in that sense. This is the characteristic in the way that he greets this. And he asks it a flurry of questions and questions that it can't answer. So it's marked by a sort of an intensity here that we don't see in the Ode to a Nightingale. It's only 5 stanzas. The other was 9, but nonetheless still the 10-line stanza feature. And in the same way that the Ode to a Nightingale had jumped from one stanza and then there's this hiatus and then jumped to another, we find the exact same thing here. So a sense of a breach and then a re-engagement. And maybe he's walking around the urn. That was one thing that I thought might be the reason why he's doing it. But then I noticed actually he's doing this in all of his spring odes. It's just it's more of the dramatic way in which he decides to present his mind engaging with the world around him. But I think I've run out of my time and I will curtail that because I want to hear your questions. You've heard me a bit, I could say a lot more, but let me leave off with that.
Thank you, sir.
You're very
Participants
welcome.
know that certificates will be generated for those who fill in the feedback form. And now we are headed to the Q&A session of the event. Due to the lack of time, a few selected questions will be read out by Lyra Johnson.
Thank you, Niha. Sir, shall I read out the questions? Megha has raised the first question, and the question is, can synesthesia be taken into account while doing a Freudian analysis of Keats' subconsciousness?
So Keats will also, so Freud also uses the concept of, oops, I'm having a little feedback there. Freud also uses the term synesthesia and the concept thereof, does he? And the question was, once again, can it be read in a Freudian way because of that? That's the question? So I'm not sure how a Freudian analysis would work. I'm trying to think, even if I've read a Freudian critic, and as I say, when I spent a year on Keats' Ode on the Grecian Urn, I can't recall a Freudian critic on this particular poem. It doesn't really invite itself. There's no sense of sublimation. So when I refer to the sublime, for Freud, sublimation is a form of something surface, the threshold, the limit to push below acceptable. I don't get that sense here. It's synesthesia in the non-Freudian, just the conflation of divergent senses, the five senses. So associating things that don't normally get associated. And as I say, Keats, in describing things that he sees or things that he hears, often will evoke the sense of taste or touch. That sense of synesthesia, which has a richness to it, but I don't think there's any Freudian angle to that. But maybe I could be enlightened on that, but I don't see it myself.
The next question is by Niha. The question is, in Ode to a Nightingale, Nightingale's song is seen as offering relief from the day-to-day pains of living. But the immortality of the song makes Keats painfully aware of the human fragility of his own life. Isn't that a paradox?
It really is. And we'll find, I didn't get into the Ode on a Grecian Urn, but he finds the exact same thing. As I said with the Grecian Urn, it's immortal art. It's the grandeur of Greek art. It's the timeless nature of Greek art. But the very timelessness of the art reminds him that he is a creature of space and time, that he himself is mortal, and so he finds it dissatisfactory. So the sense of transcendence or sublimity that in both cases, both odes reflect, leaves him with a very bad taste in his mouth. He does not find it satisfactory. That's what comes out of it. And as I say, the poems don't come up with a sense of resolution. There's a sense of rupture, a sense of dissatisfaction that comes from the encounter. Delight, but at the same time, a sense of being jilted or rebuked.
Sir, a participant, AJ Thomas, has asked for your comments on Keats as the most romantic of the romantics.
Well, well, the romantics never called themselves romantics, first of all. It was a term that was used after them. In terms of romantic, it depends what we mean by romantic here. If we mean romantic in the conventional sense, at least the conventional sense that we associate it with here in Canada, it would be in relation to love, to love between the sexes, not the love of God or anything like that. That's not the sense that the romantics taken as a whole, as a school or a period of poetry, that's not what the romantics mean. I'm not even quite sure why the word romantic is used. The word roman is used in French and in German to refer to the novel. and so there might be something about it's a novel approach to the period. I've looked into the etymology of the Romantic period and where it comes from and why it's called that, but it's not wholly satisfactory. There is something novel about it without a doubt, but it's not focused on romantic love. There's very little of that in romantic poetry, in fact. Very little. There's little drama. If you read Wordsworth, you would never know that the opposite sex existed. Very little. There's more in Byron and to a lesser extent in Keats and Shelley, but there's at least some in Shelley, or in Keats rather. So there is maybe the most romantic in the sense that he is characteristically focused on the life of the mind, but not in the sense that his love has a conventional object, namely another person. He's not writing a love sonnet to a woman. He's not writing an ode to a woman. He's writing an ode, once again, to very strange objects. The word ode means a song. What are the songs to? To Psyche, to a nightingale, to a Grecian urn, to melancholy, and to indolence. These are very strange objects to be subject of love lyrics. If that's what it's meant, I'm not sure if that is what is meant by that.
And that was our last question. Thank you, sir.
Oh.
Now I hand over.
Thank you, Lida. As we wind up the meeting, I cordially invite Dr. Meera Matthew to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Niha. Honorable guest speaker of the day, Dr. Scott Massen, respected head of the department, Reverend Dr. Joseph, respected principal, Dr. Sister Therese, respected convener of the international webinar series, Ms. Rosmi Khatur, most valued invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. We have thus paid a great befitting tribute to our great poet. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of the Postgraduate Department of English, Alphonsa College, Pala, and the entire participants attending the webinar, I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Dr. Scott Massen for the memorable Keats bicentennial lecture. Thank you, Dr. Scott Massen, for gracing the occasion and sharing with us your words of wisdom. You are an exemplary person, and we have a lot to learn from you.
Thank you.
And an appreciative audience is always a good motivation in our pursuit of excellence. On behalf of the Department of English, Alphonsa College, Pala, I express my gratitude to all the participants for joining us to commemorate the poet of beauty and truth. I hope you have received great insights from the lecture and are filled with mellow fruitfulness. Wholeheartedly, I thank our principal, Dr. Sister Therese Madikaguri, for her support and guidance. Our head of the department, Reverend Dr. Joseph, always encourages and motivates us. Thank you, Father, for being with us in organizing such a wonderful event. We are indeed grateful to IQAC Alphonsa College, Pala for the technical support. This webinar was a brainchild of our beloved Rosmi ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for enabling us to pay a befitting tribute to our young romantic Keats. The support, technical expertise, and encouragement of Shruti ma'am is invaluable. We have been fortunate enough to get the support of all the faculties from the Department of English. I thank all the students and the teachers for their presence this morning. Heartfelt congratulations to the organizing team for making such a memorable, making this work, this function, such a memorable one for all of us. Thank you, dear Niha, for comparing the session, and Lida Johnson for handling the Q&A session. Special thanks to dear Anu Alphonse, the artist who designed our beautiful brochure and certificates. I'm grateful to our dear students for working closely to mark this function a great success. Thank you, one and all. Have a great day.
Thank you, ma'am. The meeting has come to an end. On behalf of the Department of English, Alphonsa College, Pala, I thank every one of you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. What an honor.